of work. The session is chaired by Dr. Radhika Kapoor, Senior Fellow, Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. The panelists include Srinivasan Iyer, Senior Program Officer, Ford Foundation, Professor Santosh Mehrotra, Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Dr. Numan Majid, Senior Employment Specialist, International Labor Organization. I request everyone to please take their seat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shubham, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the session on the future of work. So, developments in the world of work have attracted immense attention recently. They've stirred significant debate amongst policymakers, academics, and even the public. And on this particular forum, we've in fact had several conversations on the future of work. Oddly, despite the intensity of the debate on the subject, no commonly accepted vision of the future of work has emerged. There is no universally accepted definition of what the future of work encompasses, what the relevant drivers in the world of work will be. Much of the existing literature and the public discourse that we have seen on the subject has actually focused on the fourth industrial revolution and the technologies underlying it, in particular artificial intelligence and robotics. But it's important to be cognizant of the fact that in addition to these technological changes, there are several other transformative forces which are affecting the world of work and which are in fact likely to have a more long-lasting impact on the world of work. So therefore, when we have this conversation here on the future of work, it's important to look not just at technology, but also how issues like globalization, demographic changes, climate change, all of this is going to impact the future of work. And it's only then when we look at all these forces concomitantly will we get a clear sense of what the challenges are and where the opportunity lies, what the appropriate policy responses should be if we in fact want to harness these opportunities. Now, the G20 is actually a very pertinent forum to discuss these issues because labor markets and the issues that are affecting them are increasingly global and they are interlinked. So it's important that we all come together to understand how we can craft a more equitable future of work. Having said this, it's also important to point out that the G20 brings together both the developed and the developing world, and the way the future of work will pan out in developing and emerging markets will in fact be quite different from that of advanced economies. And as Secretary Garg said in the morning, very often we find that the discussions at the G20 tend to be dominated by the concerns of the advanced economies. And this is particularly true about the issue of future of work. The way the discussion is evolving at the G20, the metrics and the semantics which are defining that debate, they are in fact quite divorced from the reality of emerging markets. So in that sense, there is no single future of work, and we need to factor that into our discourse. Because essentially developing economies, the nature of challenge that is faced by emerging and developing economies, particularly India, is of a completely different order. Most of our workforce continues to be trapped in informal employment, in precarious and vulnerable employment. So therefore, when we have conversations about things like the gig economy, we need to recognize that already, non-standard forms of employment are very rampant in this context. So it may well be the case that with the emergence of these new non-standard forms of employment, informality may well become the norm in economies such as ours. Now, one of the questions, of course, in the context of developing economies is the one about how informal employment will pan out. The other critical question is about structural transformation. What is the nature of structural transformation that these economies are going to witness? Very often we get to hear that with automation and mechanization and robotics, a path of structural transformation driven by manufacturing will actually be a less accessible path of growth and development. And this is really a big question mark, and I hope that some of the panelists in this discussion will address this, because this is really critical for us to understand which sectors are going to drive job growth in the future of work. The question simply is also not one of which sectors are going to drive job growth, but also about the organization of production. In developing economies such as ours, we are a labor surplus economy. Our economy is dualistic in structure. We have a large unorganized sector which coexists with a much smaller organized sector. So all the transformative forces that we are seeing in the world of the work, it's important to understand how they are going to affect the organization of production. Are we in fact going to see a move from the unorganized to the organized sector, reducing this dualism, or is it going to be the other way around? So we do have a whole host of issues to discuss. But then again, the question is not just about jobs and what impact all these changes are going to have on employment, but also on the distribution of income. Because we know that there are people with certain sort of skill sets who will benefit disproportionately more than others. So addressing the issue of inequality becomes very pertinent in this discussion. And one other key issue here is that in this fourth industrial revolution, in particular, when you talk about things like robotics, we are going to see a lot of transfer of income happening from labor to the owners of capital, the owners of machines, and robotics. So essentially, we're going to see transfer of income from those who have a high marginal propensity to consume to those who have a high marginal propensity to save. Now, in this scenario, what is going to happen to aggregate demand? Are we going to see a weakening of aggregate demand? And I think those are some of the issues that also need to be brought into the future of work agenda. So on that note, let me end. I hope we have a very fruitful discussion and we're able to expand the ambit of the discussion on future of work to go simply beyond the fourth industrial revolution, and more importantly, outline appropriate policy responses to address the challenges that lie ahead. Because eventually it's going to be our policy responses that will shape the nature of this transition and the outcome of the future of work. On that note, I'd like to start by inviting Mr. Srinivasan Iyer for his presentation. You can speak from here.
Thank you, Radhika, and thanks, ICRIER, for inviting me for something that's deeply, deeply critical to the world that we live in. And let me pick up from where Radhika mentioned that we are looking at very, very diverse futures of work. Even within the G20 grouping, countries such as India and Indonesia occupy really a very, very different space relative to, say, some of the Northern European countries or the US. And whereas they may not be a dichotomy, as I just mentioned, we are really divided. I mean, it might be more of a continuum. However, we do have two different worlds. On the one hand, there are a very, very large number of workers who are in low productivity, low wage, extremely precarious forms of work. And on the other hand, the wage workers and so own enterprise workers who are in a significantly higher productivity, higher wages, and relatively more stable forms of employment. And there's everything else in between. Now, whereas there is no sort of clear geographical coincidence, yet broadly, I mean, the terms global south and global north does seem to fit, where regions where sort of significantly maybe 75% of the workers fall in the former category, they typically belong to the global south vis-a-vis the rest. On the flip side, of course, the global north also is the host to most of capital, be it dominant firms or be it in fact the new more mobile forms of capital such as private equity and pension funds. Now, in the 80s and the 90s and the 90s, actually, they saw probably the first major wave of convergence, where on the one hand, you had countries in the global south, starting with the eastern sort of part of Asia into China, where they saw significant rise in average productivity as well as the drawing of the workforce into those sectors, and perhaps a marginal improvement in precarity. At the same time, the global north also witnessed a rapid fall in labor power. It also slowly started witnessing in fall in wage share. In fact, wage growth tended to fall behind productivity growth, and gradually there was an erosion of the quality of contracts. Now, and therefore, at least in one part of the world, was seized with optimism in the first decade of the 21st century, largely inspired by China. Now, this was also the same time when capital in a globalized world was trying to sort of invent strategies largely for two things. One is its effort to sort of reduce wage share. And this largely took two different forms. One is by shifting production across the globe to places where there is either a lower wage cost, or where it was possible to shift out internal costs either to be borne by the government or environmental costs to be borne by society. As a result of which, you have roughly about 600 million workers in global value chains now, which is, whereas in 1980 this was minuscule, it was hardly ever noticed. The second big way in which capital sought to reduce wage share is by replacing labor with capital, and that would really take up some of our attention later. The other major strategy that we notice capital adopting is competitiveness, and there it's more sort of competition for markets rather than within markets. And therefore, it's about increasing market power, it's to sort of earn higher product rent. And therefore, what you see is the emergence of superstar firms. You see a rapid decline in the bargaining power of organized labor. In fact, today in the US, there's historically low unemployment rates, but it coexists with near stagnant real wages. And wage share is actually dropping, both within nations as well as in global value chains, where more and more of the value of production accrues to the lead firms. Now, it's here that the emergence of the fourth industrial revolution technologies are now raising doubts on the optimism that workers held in the first century, in the first decade of the 21st century. And in fact, now what exactly does that mean? It means that it probably stymies the probability of workers in the global south to get into higher productivity, higher wages, and the other segment. Now, who exactly are these? So if you look at a population of 7.5 billion globally, there were 2.5 billion people who depend significantly on natural resources. They're either farmers, or fishers, or foresters, or pastoralists, or fish workers. And of these, about 1.5 billion people are smallholders. The FAO definition of less than 10 hectares if it's land, there's similar ways of categorizing folks who are not dependent purely on farming. Now here is, all of these, in fact, their lives are getting even more precarious because there's perhaps for them more than fourth industrial revolution technology. It's climate change that's a big spoiler. So I mean, they're facing extreme weather events even as we speak. There's rising intensity, there's greater frequency, there's definitely rising temperature, including oceanic temperature. So fish migrate, grazing ground shift, crops need to change. And this is the same time when states across the world are withdrawing public investment. So no longer is there enough investment to try and anticipate change. No longer is there enough public investment in preparing the world for change. And therefore the future that these 1.5 billion people face is very, very bleak. So I think I just have 2 or 3 recommendations. One of the big issues for G20 is not to take their eyes off the 2.5 billion people who till a foreseeable future will continue to depend on natural resources and only face a more and more uncertain world. And here, in fact, to borrow from some of the most radical discussions around the UN Framework Convention, we have to uphold at least 2 sort of major principles. One is polluter must pay, and the other is carbon equity. And carbon equity drives us to look at historical emissions. It also drives us to look at carbon dioxide distribution based on consumption, or the final demand for embodied carbon. And we must bear in mind that all OECD countries are actually net importers of carbon. And within G20, there's a very, very wide variation. Per capita emissions based on final demand of the top 3 are 10 times the per capita emissions of the bottom 3. So there's both a distributional issue as well as an issue which has immense significance for the future of work. Now let me turn to the other big risk in the way global capital operates, and that's modern technologies. Now if we look at recent changes, it's no longer just that machines are going to come and take over repetitive or routine manual tasks. It is not even that they're going to take over routine cognitive tasks. In fact, now as we see computing costs decreasing rapidly, and as we see tremendous capabilities in data capture and data storage, machine learning or artificial intelligence becomes far more important, and therefore non-routine tasks, both manual and cognitive, are under stress. Now what would this mean? We can only speculate on the number of workers that would be rendered superfluous. In fact, one of the most convincing studies that were undertaken about 4 or 5 years ago places 47% of the US workforce under potential displacement. I mean, this is very, very significant, because such studies have been picked up, and in fact there are others who offer very, very wide ranges or very, very widely differing estimates. Now what exactly is at stake here? We must understand that the pace of the fourth industrial revolution is not determined merely by technological feasibility. We also need to pay attention at wage costs, both sort of static wage costs as well as differences across geographies. We also need to pay attention to the regulatory ecosystem. We must bear in mind that that governments across the world feel pressed to take decisions, and in fact some of both the global discourse as well as sort of the discussions within India on Uber and e-retailing platforms are quite instructive, that it's not going to be just a smooth path just because technology is available, the world gets transformed. And we must also realize that technology or technological change does not have a mind of its own. It's largely driven by capital. In fact, I was reading a survey of some of the key controllers of capital who attended Davos in 2019, and it was very, very clear, that for those who controlled capital, it was merely one tactic to gain market dominance. But we also must realize that those who control capital are also very, very keen to ensure that there is legitimacy and there's also political sustainability. So that by itself also could set certain limits, pace and direction of the deployment of technology. If indeed, however, the fourth industrial revolution technologies do displace workers, we have very diverse scenarios. So on the one hand, we anticipate, and this could be the more optimistic scenario, that there would simultaneously be a rise in the scale of production and a sustained demand for labor. Not perhaps labor where it is now, but labor where it could go in the future. And those who actually hold this keep referring back to previous phases of significant transformation of technology and say that even the future also would hold the same. They also say that there will be a shift in demand for labor, and therefore it's merely re-equipping labor. And in fact, lastly, there are also a set of folks who have a fairly influential view that if there is a shrinkage in the global workforce, it is only a strong response to an aging of the global population and to a shrinkage in the workforce in some of the advanced countries. This has tremendous distributional implications, because you still have a large number of countries in the world which are densely populated, which are very, very young, and which have a growing workforce. A more pessimistic view, however, reads the acceleration of job loss with a fall in labor power and a permanent decline in wage share. And here is where, in fact, this phase of technological transformation is significantly different from the previous phases, because it comes at a time when inequality is sharply rising across the world. It comes at a time when there's already been a sharp decline in wage share. And therefore, the problem of effective demand that Radhika mentioned would really swing in. Therefore, it's difficult to imagine that there would be, that demand would rise at the scale at which it rose during the previous sort of episodes or periods of technological transformation, and we may have a serious issue. The other is this might accelerate rising inequality, and we already see a lot of political disturbance across the world in response to rising inequality, and it would certainly be prudent for G20 to consider both of these. However, if indeed we go sort of recklessly along the path then I just want to end with a study by the World Economic Forum, which says that of the 1.4 million people who lose their jobs over the next decade, the private sector could profitably reskill merely 25%. So whereas we can have discussions on skilling, we can have discussions on retooling labor so that they continue to stay inside the workforce, here is perhaps the most optimistic view of what is feasible, and we need that to bear in mind. And that's really what we would expect the G20 countries to deeply consider when they're examining this issue. Thank you.
For that, Srinivasan. That was really pertinent in the context of what I said at the beginning in drawing the distinction between the developed and the developing and emerging markets in this discussion. I think the issue that you touched on in agriculture is particularly pertinent in India because about half the workforce still relies on agriculture, and they will, especially the small and marginal farm holders, and they will be the ones who will be disproportionately affected by climate change. You also talked about technological and economic feasibility, and I think that's again a very important point because very often when we have this discourse in developing countries, we treat technology as an exogenous force, and we assume that simply because the technology is feasible and being adopted in the advanced world, the same scenario will be applied here, and we don't take into account the economic feasibility factor. But what struck me the most from your comments, and which I hope to get back to in the end, is the point about the declining bargaining power of labor and what that means for the erosion of the social contract, because that social contract is really what defines the relationship amongst the actors in the world of work. So now, could I please request Professor Santosh Mehrotra for his presentation?
Thanks very much indeed, Radhika, and thank you, Rajat and Dr. Ahluwalia for inviting me to speak on the future of work in the G20, the twin challenges of technological transformation and the IR4. So let me tell you the structure of my presentation. I'll begin by talking about the IR4 impacts on the rich countries and compare them with what is happening in the EMEs. Secondly, I'll go on to talk about a little more about the impact, more specifically on the EMEs, particularly talk about the impacts in India. And I'll sort of spend most of my time actually discussing not just the impacts, but also what the challenges are for EMEs generally, but also for India. And I identified 3 challenges, which I'll come to in a second. So we've recently had WDR on IR4. And I think what we need to remind ourselves, above all, is that while this is IR4 is the 4th industrial revolution, there have been 3 before this, and every industrial revolution, which is whether it was the late 19th century one, the first one, or the late 18th century one, or the late 19th century one, the second one, or the sort of second half of the last century, the third one, the digital revolution, all of them have both destroyed jobs as well as created jobs. So honestly, my starting point is that jobs will get created as well as get destroyed over this period. And we should begin by reminding ourselves that over the period 1999 to 2016 in Europe alone, these same IR4 technologies have actually replaced routine work, but they have also created more than 23 million jobs. How does this happen? Well, technological change creates jobs directly in the tech sector, smartphones, tablets, portable devices, which we all use now. We use them for our work. We use them to organize our finances. After all, workers create online interfaces, which drives this growth. What we do know, of course, is that, and this is what the research is establishing, that workers in codifiable routine tasks will get replaced. I mean, when we talk about robots we know are being increasingly used in the auto sector, in the electronics and electrical sector. These are the two sectors in manufacturing where they are being used most. And jobs are indeed getting relocated from developing countries. Vietnam has just experienced that. Other countries have experienced that. So how generally is the world of work changing? Jobs are normally categorized into 4 categories. One, routine manual, second, routine cognitive, a third is non-routine manual, and the fourth is non-routine cognitive. What we have learned over the life of IR4 is that what is happening is that skill demands are changing significantly. Demands are rising for skills that robots cannot replace. For instance, non-routine cognitive and non-manual skills are increasing. IR4 is also disrupting demand, and it's disrupting demand for 3 types of skills. One, non-routine cognitive skills are rising in both developed and in EMEs. For instance, conducting research, managing teams, nursing and caring. Secondly, the demand for routine cognitive skills is falling. Processing payrolls, bookkeeping, operating welding machines, this kind of demand is falling. And thirdly and finally, very importantly, the payoffs to combinations of different types of skills is increasing. Let me turn to this issue of the differences between rich countries and the emerging market economies. It's interesting that both our earlier speakers actually mentioned this. There's an emergence, of course, we know, of the gig economy, which is causing convergence in the nature of labor markets in both rich countries and in EMEs, because it is leading to a fluid workforce emerging in rich countries and, of course, in EMEs and particularly in India, we know about the persisting informality, which could very well be increasing. So this is the nature of the convergence. So what is the implication of this? The implication of this clearly seems to be that instead of workers demanding benefits from employers, now social insurance or welfare is likely to be demanded from the state. And I think this is a way forward for most emerging economies which have not managed to provide social insurance for its unorganized sector workers. And I have personally been involved in advising the Indian government in moving towards this. Question, will massive automation mean the old path of development through industrialization taken by Germany, Japan, South Korea, and then China not available to us? Possibly. There is a real difference that late industrializers and early industrializers face. And what is the nature of this difference? This is referring to the question that Radhika had raised about structural transformation. Among the EMEs, there is a key difference between early convergence countries based on manufacturing on the one hand and late convergence countries. Because the late convergence countries, as they try and industrialize, are now facing the adverse effects of automation and of IR4. And the big difference here is the scale and quality of the human capital available within the economy. In early convergence, we find an alignment of human capital endowment. In other words, the East Asian countries in particular, they had educated but relatively unskilled labor, and they moved in the structural transformation process from agriculture to manufacturing that spread dynamism to the economy. So the Lewisian transformation from farm to factory was possible because of this coincidence between growth on the one hand, growth and transformation, which was based on comparative advantage. However, late industrializers, and India is clearly one of them, and many of the other EMEs, even in the Asian region, are among them. G20 EMEs are prominent. They face a double challenge. They fail to provide basic education early enough in the development process, necessary for that earlier structural transformation. But that failure is now a serious drag because the human capital frontier for the new structural transformation has shifted farther away. And technology will increasingly favor highly skilled human capital, which is the reason why all of us, the EMEs, have to think about building a national innovation system in our EMEs, which cannot be constructed without an equitable distribution of the human capital in the entire workforce, which is currently lacking. So the dual challenge of the late industrializers is quite serious. What about India? Let me turn my attention to India. What about IR4 and jobs in India? Well, let's think of 4 possibilities. New jobs will get created, of course. Second, jobs will get threatened. There'll be other kinds of jobs where changing jobs will require new skills. And then, of course, there'll be still a large mass of jobs which will be unchanged. I want to report to you from perhaps what I know is the only survey that was done by the Observer Research Foundation along with the World Economic Forum of about 770 enterprises in late 2018 in 4 sectors: in garments, in banking, finance, financial services, insurance, logistics, and retail, where new technologies, IR4 technologies, as well as digital infrastructure-related technologies have been adopted. What do they tell us? What is the summary from that? More than twice, and this is the good news, more than twice as many companies report having needed to hire additional workers due to the adoption of industrial technologies and machinery than those that needed to reduce their number of workers. So you can begin to understand the optimistic note I struck at the beginning. Not just because every industrial revolution has this dual character of creating and destroying, but we are beginning to see this in our own case. Similarly, the adoption of digital tools and services in the last 5 years in these 770 companies, of course in the organized sector, has led to a need for additional workers. Of course, also 33% of companies report needing workers with new skills due to technological adoption. And companies plan to address these skill gaps by training existing workers and also having workers learn on the job. So let's just explore this idea of the impacts in India on manufacturing, on services, on the female labor force participation rate, which, as you all know, has been falling in our country, on micro, small, and medium enterprises. So robots have begun to be used for some time, mainly in auto manufacturing in India, not in other sectors very significantly. 2014 data tells us that about 11,800 operational robots were operating. That number has risen by about 6,000 in the last few years. And of course, as you can imagine, we are way behind China, which has a stock of about 68,500. And the important point about robots in China is that most of their robots are largely domestically produced. In India, we have essentially 2 manufacturers which are manufacturing robots. The other sector which I mentioned earlier, which globally is employing more robots, which is electricals and electronics, we don't see much evidence of that in India. What about 3D printing? Well, 3D printing usage is maturing in India as a service with particularly auto manufacturers. But large-scale deployment requires software sophistication and awareness around the technology, both of which are currently lacking. What about the Internet of Things? Indian IoT service sector is perhaps the most dynamic among the IR4 technologies, and the IoT sector already owns 40% of the global market through TCS, Tata Consultancy, Wipro, Infosys, etc. Cloud computing industry is also growing rapidly. It was generating about $2 billion worth of revenue in 2015, and it should rise to about $10 billion or 5 times by 2020. There are other impact points, which I won't go into in the interest of time. Let me quickly turn to some larger issues. Digital technology is actually creating opportunities in India. We are all aware of the falling female labor force participation rate phenomenon in India. But what I would argue is that IT infrastructure is actually enabling flexible working conditions, and this suits women. Also, it reduces the demand for heavy labor through mechanization that allows more women on the shop floor industries. For instance, more women can be seen now in the engineering and metal plants in Tata Steel. Tech startups, well, 10% of them are by women and growing. And this is very important because it's critical because women's education levels have risen very rapidly in the last 10 years or so, a subject I'll come back to it shortly. What about MSMEs? Radhika rightly mentioned that we have the vast majority of our enterprises are in the unorganized sector, and MSMEs. What one sees is that MSMEs can actually benefit from digital technology. Smartphone users in our country are growing very rapidly. Cloud services are spreading, reducing the cost of IT services to a fraction of what it was before. And 20 million firms could actually are accessing digital business in the cloud, which clearly is likely to benefit the bigger ones among the MSMEs. And we all know, of course, the potential of job creation through the platform economy and e-commerce. Let me turn finally to the challenges. Let me turn to the challenges. And these are challenges not just for India, these are challenges for many of the emerging market economies. What we are lacking is an industrial policy. We have had no real industrial policy in the last 25 years after economic reforms began. The result of that is that the manufacturing share of GDP, which was 16, 17% in 1991, is still at 17%. The share of manufacturing employment has never risen above 12.5%, which is way below what the East Asians achieved, and the East Asians always had an industrial policy. And unfortunately, such industrial policy that we had before 1980 never really utilized India's most abundant factor of production labor. So we've got a real problem here. And we really need to learn the lessons from the East Asians. And I think we need to remind ourselves that 100 countries in the world post the global economic crisis have actually adopted industrial policies. And clearly, India and other EMEs among the G20 cannot lag behind. A second challenge, of course, I've already flagged earlier, education and skills. We should remind ourselves that most of the East Asian countries had not just an industrial policy. They had an education and skills policy which was aligned to the industrial policy. Thankfully, thanks to the efforts in our country in the last 10 years, not just primary enrollment, but secondary enrollment went from about 58% in 2010 to 95% in 2017, secondary enrollment. And this happened with gender parity, which means an increasing proportion of our young are much better educated and clearly will not want to work in agriculture. And what happened along with this was a phenomenal increase in tertiary enrollment for the relevant age cohort, 18 to 23-year-olds, from 11% in 2006 to 27% in the year 2017 of a rising cohort. So clearly, we've now created the human capital base. Quality has to improve. We still have to increase our investments in education, but clearly a clear diversion of students early on towards vocational education, towards vocational training is absolutely critical so that they don't continue into the tertiary stream without necessarily acquiring employability skills. and that requires a new focus. The IR4 imperative is one imperative. The other imperative is the imperative coming from the need for enhancing manufacturing. Let me close by just mentioning the fact that many developing countries, especially in Asia, have tended towards an Anglo-Saxon model of vocational education and training, as opposed to the much more effective, much more efficient, and much more productive Germanic model. I just want to sort of focus your attention on one point here. Unfortunately, even we have gone the Anglo-Saxon route. I don't have the time to develop this. I have written a significant amount on this. The real problem with the Anglo-Saxon model is the focus in the skill development, within the skill development focus on narrow attributes, narrow skilling for particular jobs rather than broad occupations, which is the model which the Germans have had. And given the fact that our economy and most of the EME economies are rapidly diversifying, and because technology is changing so rapidly, it's absolutely critical that skill development is for broad occupational groups and not for narrow jobs and narrow skills. Let me just close then by emphasizing that in addition to this contrast between the Germanic and the Anglo-Saxon one, we should also build up a national innovation system, and that requires a focus on R&D, which we haven't had in most of the emerging market economies. India, for instance, not different from the EMEs, spends only 0.82% on R&D. But despite this, we've had impressive growth in scientific publications. We're 5th in the world, and patents filed are 6th in the world. But an increase in R&D, especially in the private sector, is very important and very urgent. This will not help society because if we do not increase public expenditure and private expenditure, in other words, we have to incentivize private companies to increase their R&D expenditure. Otherwise, the possibility of our meeting the challenges that imported IR4 technologies is going to place us in might become overwhelming. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Mehrotra, for that very optimistic presentation. It's wonderful that you started by outlining what we call in the literature the reinstatement effect, and the fact that there's just not going to be job displacement. And as you correctly pointed out, two critical policy responses. I mean, one, industrial policy. Very often we argue that, again, manufacturing is not going to be able to create jobs because of automation and the use of industrial robotics. But as you illustrated through the use of your data, it's evident that, this is not such a big concern at this point also. And data from the International Federation of Robotics, in fact, tells us that the use of robotics in India is just 3 per 10,000 employees, while the global average is 74 per 10,000 in the manufacturing sector. So we still have a considerable opportunity there in terms of giving an impetus to the growth of our manufacturing sector, and putting in place an industrial policy is absolutely imperative. And as we understand from several news reports, I think the Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion is in the process of developing such a policy. So we hope we can see some movement on that, and a policy that actually focuses on those sectors which can create jobs for India, in particular labor-intensive sectors. And I think your presentation on skilling and education was absolutely fantastic. And what I took away from that was that we really need a paradigm shift in the way we think of skilling and moving from the Anglo-Saxon to the Germanic framework if we want to address the challenges that are going to emerge in the future of work. Finally, I'd like to turn to our last speaker, Mr. Noman Majid.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think I'll start by saying that that a lot of some of the work some things that I wanted to cover, right? I mean, in a broad way, which I probably would not have been able to, right? Santosh has done, right? Because he's given us a big tour de force and a big picture of larger issues at stake. I will now, what I will do is that instead of focusing on the future of work as such, I would take a cue from what Radhika said earlier on and go towards the future of workers, right? And look at structural change in India. So I will specifically look at India and try and I'll just like to say before I start that a lot of what I say is completely consistent with sectoral approaches as far as policy are concerned, that we know what sectors should lead and what kind of industrial policy and so on and so forth that we should have, right? A word on structural change and productivity first. I mean, in development economics, this is something supposed to be quite specific. It starts off with Lewis or two-sector models. And basically, large developing economies are characterized by what we call surplus labor and underemployment, which is the main source of dualism in these economies, employment dualism. Structural change is associated with the transfer of labor from low to higher productivity sectors and is an important mechanism in the growth of economy-wide productivity. Now, the other source of growth, which I will not talk about in this presentation, is in growth in productivity pertains to capital accumulation and technology, which is used in production. It can be argued that if the engine of output growth is manufacturing, then labor transfer from low to high productivity sectors will in turn increase economy-wide productivity and will have, at least in the longer run, beneficial dualism reducing employment effects. Well, at least in the longer run, this is what theory told us. How I will go about my presentation is to first I will set up the employment problem in India, as I've been able to understand it, right, by putting up two tables. And this will spell out the limits of this terrible word that we use, which is inclusion, right? That, we put inclusion in front of or after every other statement and then relegate it to margins, right? So it will spell out the limits to inclusion, right, as far as growth is concerned, from the point of view of employment. Then I will put forward 4 stylized facts about the organized and unorganized part of the Indian economy. And these are about employment, productivity, consumption, and labor transfer between an unorganized and organized part of the economy. I will then show some results from productivity growth decompositions, and these are simple growth accounting procedures whereby you break up productivity growth into one component which is supposed to be associated with labor reallocation, which is called structural change, and the other which is associated with capital, right? It can be capital deepening, it can be capital accumulation, a black box which is associated with capital. Okay. So I will put out some results, right, on that basis, and then I will go back to the stylized facts, right, that we've talked about, which I have shown earlier on, and try and interpret what has happened, right? And that might give us some clue as to answering answering the problem that we face in what I present just now first, which is the problem of employment, which is what I'll set up now. So it'll go around in a circle. Okay, now how do I do that? I just page down. Okay, so setting up the employment problem. So this is something that a lot of us know. I've done, all possible bases on which one can actually calculate output, right? And this is just to show that, I will be focusing on 2000, 2012, right? If I'm not one of those people who is privy to leak data, so I can't really use the 2017-18 NSSO data. But so I restrict myself to 2000, 2012, and in fact, it's good because the picture is neater. when we look at that period, and it doesn't affect the argument. Productivity growth, let's just focus on that, forget 2016, right, is 5.5%, what we calculate, which is pretty good. And there's a range of growth rates that we can see, right, which is the output growth rates, and they're also quite consistent with what most people calculate, between 7.5%. Okay. So India has had high output growth and productivity growth. Second point, but the employment has not witnessed commensurate improvements in employment structure. Now, most people will be familiar with this classification. Yeah, I can just quickly go through it for those who might not be. Regular formal employment is wage employment, which is regular and which has some kind of social security, i.e., not comprehensive, not every kind of security, but some kind of social security. It's the best form of employment. Regular non-formal is without any security, but it is regular, it is waged. In dark, regular is them together. Then we have casual workers and self-employed, and they constitute together what we call non-regular employment. Now, as we can see that with this process of growth, productivity growth of about 5.6% or so in the period, regular employment increased from 15.3% to 19.3% of the total employment in the country. Okay, that's still not that great. Non-regular employment declined, yes, but from 84% to 84.7% to 81%. So the transformation in the qualitative structure of employment has been very, very slow, right? I mean, of course, someone might want to say that, at least it's not worsened, but certainly it has been quite slow. Okay. So this sets up a problem, right? Basically, a very slow increase in regular employment, a slow decline in non-regular employment, and interestingly, right, as far as the best form of employment is concerned, which is with some security, as a share of total all regular employment, that is also going down, right? So you can see 7.9, regular employment 19.3. That ratio is actually going down over time. Okay. Problem set. Good growth, good productivity growth, not such a good employment outcome, or marginally okay employment outcome. Okay, now I come to those stylized facts that I said before we go to the decomposition. First stylized fact is about the fact that better forms of employment dominate the organized economy and poorer forms of employment dominate the unorganized economy. We know that, right? And so just taking the last table forward, right, we can see that in, say, for example, 2012, right, you can see that 82.5 or 82.3% of employment in the organized economy was regular, so it's dominated by regular. And in the unorganized economy, right, 90%, right, of it, 90.1%, right, is non-regular. So there is a domination of employment type with respect to the organized and unorganized sector. Incidentally, the definitions of organized and unorganized that I used, right, is not just a cutoff point of people number of people working in enterprise, but it's based on the National Accounts Statistical Publication on Factor Incomes, right, which was 2008 publication. So they identify specific different sectors, right, in which they do this demarcation. Okay. So next stylized fact is that the organized economy has higher productivity levels than the unorganized economy, but both have grown. So you can see that if you see the ratio of organized to unorganized in productivity, organized to unorganized, you see it's always higher than one and pretty high. It's narrowing over time, right? But still, it's quite high. And if you see labor productivity growth, then 5.5 we saw earlier on. Organized sector is 4.2%, unorganized is 4.9%. So it's quite high, right? So it's not as if there's been stagnation in the unorganized economy. That's not true, right? I've given standard deviations. I could give any variance for another purpose. Maybe we can come back to it. I mean, if I don't need to explain why, then I won't. It's really to show that it's easier for people to move within the unorganized sector than it is from the unorganized to the organized sector. Okay. And this will be an important point, which will have some bearing on what I say later on. Third point. Yeah. Labor transfer that has occurred between the unorganized and the organized economy has been very, very limited. And you can see that, our organized employment shares as a percentage of total employment in the sector takeout, because I just reduced the table, basically in the whole economy, has been from 10.3% in 2000 to 13.9% in 2012. So this means what? 0.3% per year. It's very slow. It's very, very small. So that might tell you something about this whole business about when we talk about structural change and we talk about movement, right, from low productivity to high productivity. This is something to bear in mind. Okay. Fourth point, that productivity increases have been associated with increases in consumption. And this is sometimes something that we underplay, right? Because when we want to emphasize the problems in distribution of contractual arrangements, we tend to underplay the income side of it, right? Which is not fair. So there's no significant shift in employment structure. Right? Main positive effect of productivity increases is visible in consumption. In the unorganized economy, this is true in organized economy as well, but it's not a significant relationship. But in the unorganized economy, there's a systematic and statistically significant relationship, right? And these are all, the observations are all different sectors within the unorganized economy. And per capita household consumption expenditure. So when I say consumption per worker, I mean per capita household consumption expenditure, right? And so one increases, as one increases, the other increases. And this is change on change, so it's a strong relationship. But much more importantly than this is this, that monthly per capita household consumption, this is all NSSO data, by the way, consumption expenditure at, I've done 2012 prices, for each category of worker, right, has increased quite significantly. So even casual workers, it's risen, right, doubled, right. For self-employed, it has not increased so much, right. But for regular employment, regular formal as well as regular informal, this has increased. Okay, done. Now let's come to structural change. So this is quite straightforward. I think point to look at is the 32.1%, right? These, as I said, these things are split up. These decompositions are sort of like not, they're just growth decompositions, right? And 32% is attributable to labor transfer, and capital accumulation 67%, right? This is for, we use all the 16 times 2, i.e. 31 sectors, right? Organized and unorganized. One sector is not used. This is the technical reason. I'll come to it later on if need be. The other decomposition that we did in order to actually separate that a component of labor productivity that can be attributed to changes or shifts within the unorganized economy. Because in theory we tend to go from, as someone wrote, Santosh said, from farm to factory or whatever. And of course that is in Lewis also, that is the leap that you take. But there are many, many small differences in productivity within the informal economy as well, or within the unorganized sector as well, right? And so maybe it's a good idea to split up that component which is the movement from the unorganized to the organized, and that which is within the unorganized, right? And we find that within the unorganized, the component is much larger. 12.4%, right, is from the unorganized to the organized, right? Which is what is supposed to produce, it's a big productivity leap, so it's supposed to produce beneficial outcomes as far as reducing dualism, etc. as well. And the dominant part of it is within the unorganized sector, i.e. across small differences in productivity. Okay, so I'll not say thank you yet. Okay. So if we get back to the original problem of the weak link between growth and employment and the stylized facts, I'll say this. If labor reallocation, structural change, contribution to productivity change is dominated by movements and labor reallocation within the unorganized economy and is less about reallocation across unorganized and organized parts of the economy, and if the unorganized economy hosts the majority of employment, which is mostly non-regular, casual, and self, then it is highly unlikely that overall economy-wide distribution of employment would improve significantly with labor reallocation, structural change, contributing to increasing productivity. So it's sort of like, it's qualifying the Lewisian this thing, but actually breaking it down a little bit more to say why the outcome that we expect, right, has not come about. I could go on and deal with specificities of the organized and unorganized sectors and some other important findings which are consistent with this larger thing that we have found. And, but I don't think I have the time, and maybe at some other occasion we'll share that with you. So that's it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noman, for that extremely interesting presentation. One of the questions that several of us have been grappling with over the last few months is why employment and GDP growth have not moved together in India, and your presentation answers a lot of those questions. But more importantly, when we have this conversation about structural transformation, we tend to treat the unorganized sector as a homogeneous entity. And it's very important to point out that there's a lot of heterogeneity there. You have these own account enterprises which work without any hired laborers, and then you have the NDMEs and the DMEs which have higher productivity, and there is considerable scope for increasing productivity by moving within the unorganized sector as well. So thank you very much for bringing that point across.